Mr. President, I rise today to join my colleagues in discussing the single greatest geopolitical threat facing the United States for the next century, and that is the rise of Communist China. We are right now months into a deadly global pandemic that has sickened over 14 million people worldwide and has taken the lives of over 600,000 people. And why are we in the midst of a global pandemic? Because the Chinese Communist Party deliberately lied to the world, covered up the outbreak, and allowed it to spread. The coronavirus pandemic has thrown into high relief the fact that China is our most dangerous threat. For 8 years in the U.S. Senate, I have worked hard to lead the fight to address the threat of Chinese communist power and aggression and hostility head on, to make the United States economy as free and independent from China as possible, and to thwart the never-ending propaganda and censorship campaign from the Chinese communists.
As the Cold War ended, as the fight against the war on terror loses its luster, the bloodthirsty, apathetic entity known as the federal government of the United States continues to look for fresh blood. I won't bore you for the last 10 years about the newest enemy, which has now been under the microscope even in the last 5. Currently, even with the pandemic raging around the world. China. The threat to our world economy and importer of goods. The United States considers them now the new enemy to democracy. Back in 2018, The Week would write about the continuing lunacy of the neoconservatives and their thirst for global domination and imperialism. Under the headliner, The Continuing Lunacy of the Neocons, written by Damien Linker, date November 28, 2018, he would write, quote, 17 years after the United States overthrew the government of Afghanistan, 15 years after we toppled the government of Iraq, 7 years after we deposed the government of Libya, neoconservative pundit William Kristol announced the goal of American foreign policy over the continuing decades should be regime change in China, a nuclear power that also happens to be a population more than 4 times the size of the United States. This is important for several reasons. It's important because it shows that Kristol, despite burnishing his mainstream reputation over the past few years, and recently with his debate against Scott Horton of the Libertarian Institute, by unwavering opposition, Donald Trump remains an unrepentant neocon. It's important because along with a tweet storm Kristol produced to explain and defend his endorsement of Chinese regime change, it helps to clarify exactly what's distinctive about neoconservative foreign policy thinking. And it's important, finally, because it so clearly illustrates just how dangerous and diluted that way of thinking really is. In recent years, the term neoconservative has been emptied of meaning, used either by anti-Semites to mean Jewish conservative or by journalists as a synonym for foreign policy hawk. Neither is true to the history of the movement or what's distinctive about the evolution of its ideas. The word was originally coined as an epithet to describe a group of liberal intellectuals who migrated right-wing during the 1970s, eventually coming to support the presidency of Ronald Reagan. At the time, these writers endorsed a range of domestic and foreign policy positions. They were tough on crime, defended the conservative side in the culture war, favored work requirements for welfare recipients, and endorsed a revival of the Cold War against the Soviet Union. The first phase of neoconservative faded during the 1990s when Bill Clinton and the Republican Congress co-opted and implemented much of its domestic agenda, and the collapse of communism seemed to render its foreign policy priorities superfluous. But a second generation of neocons had other ideas. With the founding of the Weekly Standard in 1995, Bill Kristol, John Podhoretz, Robert Kagan, Charles Krauthammer, and other like-minded writers banded together to rebrand the movement as advocates for what they originally dubbed a neo-Reaganite foreign policy. At first, this mainly translated into support for American military interventions in the Balkans under President Clinton. But after George Bush was elected on a platform favoring realism and restraint, the Weekly Standard became more bellicose. During the new Republican president's first few months in office, the administration negotiated a peaceful resolution to a standoff with China after an American spy plane was forced to land by a Chinese fighter jet. Kristol's magazine responded with an editorial entitled "A National Humiliation," clearly implying that the new president should have been willing to go to war with China over the incident for the sake of saving face. Then it was 9/11. Now the neocons joined the chorus of support for deposing the Taliban government in Afghanistan and then helped lead the change to overthrow Saddam Hussein in Iraq. While many emphasize Hussein's supposed defiance of the United Nations resolutions restricting his development of weapons of mass destruction, the neocons emphasized a different consideration. For them, the issue was the need for regime change. Hussein was a ruthless dictator, an undeterrable fanatic. His government could never be trusted not to cheat on sanctions and UN restrictions, or to refrain from passing along biological, chemical, or nuclear weapons to terrorists who would strike the American homeland or its allies around the world. There was, therefore, no choice. After the 9/11 attacks, Hussein needed to be removed from power. The neocons' belief in the imperative of regime change is one of the distinctive marks of neocon foreign policy thinking. It flows from the dubious assumption that peaceful coexistence is impossible between liberal and non-liberal governments. This constitutes a sweeping rejection of realism in international affairs, which holds that most governments, regardless of their form, pursue their own interests on the world stage and can often reach mutually beneficial agreements and avoid military confrontation through negotiation and compromise. Neocons reject this, presuming that only liberal democratic governments can be considered rational. Others are dangerous, undeterrable adversaries who should never be accommodated. We can only get along if we overthrow the government of a non-democratic rival power and install a friendly one in its place. This assumption motivated the neocons' original confrontational stance toward the Soviet Union. It explains their refusal to accept the possibility that the Iran nuclear deal could have actually benefited the United States and Israel. And it's also behind their reflexively combative stance toward China. In a tweet storm follow-up to advocating regime change in China, Kristol claimed that he wasn't calling for war with China to forcibly overthrow its government. That's quite a relief. But what was he proposing instead? That the U.S. act as a force for freedom in the world, which requires us to do whatever we want? Unfree regimes to free ones or freer ones? This means regime change. But why should the stated goal of American foreign policy be the overthrow of the government of a major rising superpower in the world? Why shouldn't we aim instead to brutally check China's rise and cultivate a mutually beneficial working relationship? Kristol's response points directly to the second and more ominous mark of a neocon foreign policy thinking. The U.S. needs to affirm the goal of spreading freedom to all people everywhere. But why should this be our goal? What natural interest does it advance? Here is Kristol's answer. The goal of freedom, with its noble simplicity and even quiet grandeur, gives meaning and elevation to the American experiment. That is neoconservatism in its essence. And what separates it from other varieties of hawkish foreign policy thinking? The U.S. should seek to destabilize governments around the globe, even in the most populous nation on earth. Not primarily because it will advance our international interests, or the good of the people of Asia, or the good of the Chinese people, but because pursuing a moralistically confrontational foreign policy will be good for the United States domestically. It will give Americans a grand moral cause to fight for, elevating us in the process. Or as Kristol put it in a programmatic essay from 1996, the remoralization of America at home ultimately requires the remoralization of American foreign policy. End quote. Well, with the latest news going around the world regarding China and the United States foreign policy, we have taken turns for the worse since 2018. Washington Post headliner: China warns U.S. over reports that American forces are stationed in Taiwan. Dated October 8th, 2021. Quote, China reiterated calls for the United States to cut off military ties with Taiwan on Friday in a cautious response to reports that U.S. Marines have been stationed on the self-ruled island for more than a year to strengthen its defenses against intensifying Chinese aggression. Asked about the reports, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Zhao Lijiang avoided attacks on Washington and instead repeated standard Beijing talking points, saying that the United States should recognize the high sensitivity of the issue and halt military contact with Taiwan. China will take all necessary measures to protect its sovereignty and territorial integrity, Zhao said. China claims the island of 24 million people as part of its sovereign territory, threatening to take control by force. Taiwan's government formally declares independence. Proudly, democratic Taiwan considers itself a country and has shown no interest in submitting to Chinese Communist Party rule. About 24 U.S. troops, including a special operations unit and a contingent of Marines, have been in Taiwan to train military forces for more than a year, the Wall Street Journal reported Thursday, citing unnamed U.S. officials. End quote. It seems the Washington Post doesn't mind being a bullhorn for the Pentagon. Reuters headliner: U.S. troops rotating into Taiwan for training sources. Dated October 8, 2021. Quote, small numbers of U.S. operations have been rotating into Taiwan on a temporary basis to train with Taiwanese forces. Two sources familiar with the matter said on Thursday, speaking on conditions of anonymity. The Pentagon, which historically has not disclosed details about U.S. training or advising Taiwan forces, did not specifically comment or confirm the deployment. I don't have any comments on specific operations, engagements, or training, but I would like to highlight that our support for a defense relationship with Taiwan remains aligned against the current threat posed by the People's Republic of China, said Pentagon spokesman John Supple. Taiwan's defense ministry declined to comment, saying only that all military exchanges are carried out in accordance with annual plans. Asked on Friday about reports on the U.S. troops, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Zhao Lijiang said that the United States should cease military ties and arms sales to Taiwan to avoid damaging bilateral relations. The U.S. should fully recognize the great sensitivity of the Taiwan issue, Zhao said during a regular daily briefing. China sees Taiwan as a wayward province that has not ruled out taking the island by force. Taiwan says it is an independent country and will defend its democracy and freedom. I wouldn't rule out the possibility that Beijing is aware of this, said Bonnie Glasser, director of the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund, noting a social media post during the Trump administration about training by special forces operations. Democratic Representative Ami Bera, who leads the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Asia, was asked at a defense conference if he was made aware of the deployment. He would go on to say, not particularly this deployment, if I call it a deployment. I think we have special operators and forces there, and we have in the past that there are training Taiwan military working with them. Republican Senator Thom Tillis, who was on the Senate Armed Services Committee, told the same event he had not been made specifically aware and had only seen public reports, but added, actually, I would be happier if that number was in the thousands. Chinese military aircraft have repeatedly flown in recent days through Taiwan's expansive air defense identification zone, which extends well outside Taiwan's airspace. But China has avoided Taiwanese airspace. No shots have been fired. There have been no known close calls between Chinese and Taiwanese aircraft. But that doesn't stop the Pentagon from promoting what could be World War III. National Defense, NDA's Business and Technology magazine. Headliner, just in, Hyten says Pentagon moving unbelievably slow with modernization, dated September 13th, 2021. The Defense Department is being slowed down by bureaucracy and risk aversion as it attempts to modernize its capabilities to compete with China, the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff lamented on September 13th. During an event hosted by the Brookings Institute, General John Hyten was asked about the implementation of the 2018 National Defense Strategy and related technological developments. The downside is we're still moving unbelievably slow, Hyten said. We're so bureaucratic and we're so risk averse. Well, you don't have any potential adversaries out there. You could try to remove all risks in the system and you could go slow. But when you have a competition like China and Russia going fast, you have to be able to move fast as well. And we still move way too slow, he added. Hyten referenced the unprecedented speed at which Beijing is developing its military capabilities, particularly the modernization of its nuclear arsenal, as one of the Pentagon's top concerns. China has been rapidly building hundreds of new silos for launching nuclear missiles throughout this year, a sign of a significant expansion of its strategic arsenal, Hyten noted. The vice chairman said he was concerned about how fast the structures were being built and the motivations behind the growth, and contrasted the pace of China's nuclear modernization with the Pentagon's. Hyten also noted that the GBSD system won't achieve initial operational capability in 2030, which is the ground-based strategic deterrent program, or full operational capability until 2035. Hyten also highlighted frustrations with the Pentagon's pace in developing more resilient space architectures. That problem has persisted for over a decade, although efforts are underway at the Space Force and other agencies to address it, he noted. End quote. Take it to effect that the Congressional Budget Office released a new report called the Illustrative Options for National Defense under a Smaller Defense Budget, which outlines 3 different options for cutting funding for the Department of Defense by $1 trillion, or 14% of it at least, over the next 10 years. I'll link the report below. However, part of the report could be reiterated here, in which the Congressional Budget Office was asked to examine the effect of U.S. forces on a substantially smaller defense budget, because forces can be reduced in many ways depending on the military strategy adopted. And CBO created 3 broad options to illustrate the range of strategies that the United States could pursue under a budget that would be cut gradually by the total of $1 trillion between the years 2022 and 2031. Now, of course, this is a problem because right now we're still cutting funding from the social programs such as Social Security, healthcare, the educational system, and we're reaping the effects of this. And now on top of this, the COVID restrictions, which are at this point draconian, which have destroyed the mom and pop stores, the middle class. The options are: option 1 restrains the 2017 National Security Strategy of Deterrence by Denial, which relies heavily on U.S. combat forces to deter military aggression against allies by denying or reversing military gains in regional conflicts, the size of U.S. forces, which would be reduced in proportion to a smaller budget. Option 2 would shift emphasis from deterrence by denial to deterrence through judgment a strategy that is similar to the United States approach during the Cold War. And the option would be to emphasize the role of U.S. combat forces in regional conflicts in favor of a heavier reliance on coalition forces in combat operations. And it would call for reductions in conventional forces, such as brigade combat teams and fighter aircraft, and increases in long-range strike capabilities, such as cruise missiles, anti-ship missiles, and air defense missiles. And option 3 would focus on maintaining the freedom of navigation in sea, air, and space around the world that the United States currently enjoys. It avoids the use of large ground forces to seize and hold territory in regional conflicts in favor of engaging enemies in standoff ranges. Now, these would be viable options. However, but we are no longer the face of war has changed in that we are now a technologically advanced military where the enemy can be struck at from a great distance. Drone strikes, for example. The use for ground troops would only be needed to clean up after we saturated the area with bombs. But then you would have a military that would engage in waste spending. And that is no entity on earth wastes more money than the Pentagon. At this point, we have $12.8 trillion. I'm sorry, 12.8 billion. What is it? 12.8 trillion. $12.8 trillion unallocated funds, misappropriated funds. And where's that money going? What does that mean for our future? And why are we pushing for regional change in a country that can actually be a little bit more table setting than the United States? Is it because we found a new enemy or a revisitation back to an old enemy in communism? George Santayana once said that those who are doomed to forget the past are doomed to repeat it. Have we not learned about our mistakes during the 1960s, 70s, and even 80s regarding our adversary, the Soviet Union? Have we not learned that the draconian policies of the neoconservatives, who are in both the left and right wing of politics, that they are not for global hegemony or for human commonality, hegemony? I would submit to you that we need to implement more peaceful transition of powers, as well as building a sustainable defense for the country. At this point in time, there is no threat to the United States at all. There is no competing threat anywhere, for the exception of Russia. As for total weapons, total nuclear weapons, Russia has a speed by about 700. At this point, we have 5,550 nuclear devices. Russia has 6,257. China has 350. They pose no threat to the United States. And as for countries who have nuclear devices, the United Kingdom with 225, France with 290, India with 160, Pakistan 165, North Korea 45, and Israel, it is estimated 90, because they're the only country that is not under the nuclear treaty of the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. They're not a co-signer. Notice how we're not at war with any of these countries. Yet we tried to go to war with Russia, China, and North Korea. We still are. But we need to get rid of these fanatics within our politics to work on and to economically repair our country from within and work on foreign policy with dignitaries that aren't so war-minded. And that would mean the end of the neoconservative policies within the U.S. federal government and the Pentagon, and in our foreign policy.